Tonight we're going somewhere old, somewhere so ancient that the word ancient barely covers it. We're going to a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, to a place called Göbekli Tepe, where the oldest known temple on earth has been waiting, patiently, silently, for more than 11,000 years. Waiting in the dark of the earth, waiting to be found. 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid. 6,000 years before Stonehenge, built before agriculture, before pottery, before metal, before the wheel, by people who were supposed to be incapable of building anything at all. And then, for reasons no one can explain, they buried it, deliberately. Thousands of tons of earth piled over the stones, sealing them away, as if hiding them for a future that hadn't arrived yet. If this journey through deep time resonates with you, a gentle like helps other seekers find these stories. I'm curious. Where in the world are you right now? Let me know in the comments. Now, imagine you are standing on a rounded hilltop in the Şanlıurfa province of Turkey. It is just before dawn. The sky to the east is the color of bruised peaches, soft gold bleeding into violet, bleeding into the last deep blue of night. The air is cool, not cold, but cool enough that you can feel it on your face, on the backs of your hands. It smells of dry grass and limestone dust, and something faintly herbal. Wild thyme, maybe, or sage, carried on a breeze that has been crossing this plateau for millennia. Below you, the Harran Plain stretches south toward the Syrian border, flat and vast, the color of pale honey in the early light. To the north, the foothills of the Taurus Mountains rise in soft undulations, ancient folds of rock and earth. And here, on this hill, this belly-shaped hill, because that is what Göbekli Tepe means, belly hill or pot-belly hill, something extraordinary is emerging from the ground. You see them first as shadows, pale shapes rising from excavated pits in the hilltop. As the light strengthens, they resolve into pillars, massive T-shaped pillars of limestone, arranged in rough circles, some of them standing over 15 feet tall. They look, at first glance, like enormous stylized human figures, the flat top of the T suggesting a head, the vertical shaft a body, and if you look closely you can see that some of them have arms carved in low relief along their sides, hands reaching toward their bellies, fingers almost meeting. The stone is the color of old bone, pale cream, with patches of grey and amber where lichen has taken hold over thousands of years, and carved into these pillars, into their flat surfaces, their edges, their bases, are animals, foxes with long curving tails, snakes winding downward, wild boar with bristling backs, vultures with outstretched wings, scorpions, lions, creatures from a world that no longer exists in this landscape, a world of wild abundance that preceded farming, preceded cities, preceded everything we think of as civilization. The sun clears the horizon, light spills across the hilltop, and the pillars cast long shadows westward, and for a moment, just a moment, you can almost feel what it must have been like to stand here 12,000 years ago, when these stones were new, when the carvings were sharp-edged and freshly cut, when people gathered here for reasons we are still trying to understand. The shadows stretch and shorten. A bird calls somewhere on the plain below, a lark maybe, spiraling upward into the brightening sky. The air warms by a single degree, and you can feel it on your face. There is a quality to this place that is difficult to describe. It is not grandeur exactly, not the way a cathedral is grand or a skyscraper is grand. It is something older than grandeur. It is the feeling of standing in a place where many, many people have stood before you, over incomprehensible stretches of time, and felt something that moved them to build, to carve, to raise stone against gravity and leave a mark that says, "This mattered. We were here, and this mattered. This is Göbekli Tepe." And the story of how we found it is almost as remarkable as the site itself. For most of the 20th century, this hilltop was nothing special, or rather, it was nothing that anyone recognized as special. It was just another mound in a landscape full of mounds. Southeastern Turkey is dotted with them. Tepes, the Turkish word for hill, many of them artificial accumulations built up over centuries of human habitation. Most are exactly what they appear to be. This one was different, but no one knew it yet. Local farmers from the nearby village of Örençik had been ploughing around the strange stones that poked through the soil for generations, cursing them as obstacles, sometimes trying to break them apart with sledgehammers to clear the land for planting. In 1963, a joint survey team from the University of Istanbul and the University of Chicago visited the hill and noted some broken limestone slabs on the surface. They catalogued it as a medieval cemetery, nothing remarkable, and moved on. The T-shaped stones protruding from the earth were assumed to be grave markers. Simple as that. A quick note in a survey report, and then silence for 30 years. It's worth pausing on that. The oldest monumental architecture in the world was right there, partially visible, and trained archaeologists looked at it and saw a medieval graveyard. Not because they were foolish, they weren't, but because the idea of what they were actually looking at was simply outside the frame of what anyone thought possible. No one was looking for a temple complex built by hunter-gatherers before the invention of agriculture. The very concept didn't exist yet. It would have been like finding a Model T automobile in a Roman ruin. The mind simply refuses to process what doesn't fit its categories. And then, in October of 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt visited the site. Schmidt was working at nearby Neveli Chori, another Neolithic site that was about to be flooded by the construction of the Ataturk Dam. He was familiar with the region, familiar with the period, and when he read that old survey report from 1963, something nagged at him. Broken limestone slabs on a hilltop, T-shaped stones. These didn't sound like medieval grave markers. They sounded like something else entirely. Something he had seen fragments of at Neveli Chori, but on a scale that seemed impossible. So he drove out to the hill on that autumn day in 1994. The road was dusty, the landscape was dry, golden brown, dotted with pistachio orchards, and the occasional shepherd moving a flock of sheep across a hillside. Just another day in the Turkish countryside. He parked. He walked up the slope, and within minutes, Klaus Schmidt knew what he was looking at. He later described the moment as one of the most extraordinary of his life. His trained eye caught everything at once. The flint fragments scattered across the surface were unmistakably Neolithic, the distinctive napping patterns of tools made 10,000 or more years ago. The T-shaped stones were not grave markers. They were the tops of massive pillars still mostly buried beneath the soil, only their upper edges protruding like the tips of icebergs. And the mound itself, the belly of the hill, was not a natural formation. It was artificial. The entire hilltop had been built up, layer upon layer, by human hands, thousands and thousands of years ago. Schmidt would later say, "Within the first minute of seeing it, I knew I had two choices. I could walk away and pretend I hadn't seen it, or I could spend the rest of my life here." He chose the latter. He chose the hilltop. He chose the stones. He spent the remaining 20 years of his life excavating Göbekli Tepe, season after season, peeling back layer after layer of fill, and when he died suddenly in 2014 of a heart attack while swimming in Germany, he had barely scratched the surface. Quite literally, only about 5% of the site has been excavated to this day. 5%. The other 95% is still in the ground, still waiting. We'll come back to what that means. The excavation began in earnest in 1995, a joint project between the German Archaeological Institute and the Schönlurfer Museum. What Schmidt and his team uncovered over the following years would fundamentally alter our understanding of human prehistory. Not adjust it, not refine it, alter it. Because what they found in that hilltop was a complex of massive stone enclosures, built with sophisticated engineering, decorated with elaborate symbolic art, and dating to approximately 9500 BCE. That's 11,500 years ago. That's 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza, 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 5,000 years before the first known writing system, before pottery, before metalworking, before the wheel, before domesticated crops and livestock, before settled villages, before almost everything we associate with the word civilization. And it was built by hunter-gatherers, people who had no permanent homes, no farming, no metal tools, people who foraged for wild grains and hunted gazelle and aurochs across these plains, people who, by every assumption archaeology had made for over a century, should not have been capable of organizing the labor, the planning, the shared vision required to quarry, transport, carve, and erect stones weighing 10 tons or more. Think about your own life for a moment. Think about the planning required to organize a dinner party, or a community event, or a building project. Now imagine doing it without writing, without telephones, without any technology beyond spoken language and sharpened stone. Imagine coordinating hundreds of people from different groups who may have spoken different dialects, who lived nomadic lives following the herds, who had to be fed and sheltered during the weeks or months of construction. Imagine the person, or people, who conceived of these enclosures in the first place, who looked at a hilltop and saw not just rock and grass, but a vision of carved pillars standing in circles under the stars, and yet they did it. Let's walk through the site together. The stones have been here for 11,000 years. They have waited through the rise and fall of every civilization in human history. They can wait a few more minutes for us. The excavated portion of Göbekli Tepe reveals several large enclosures, roughly circular or oval in shape, sunk into the bedrock of the hilltop. Archaeologists have labelled the main ones Enclosure A through Enclosure D, though ground-penetrating radar surveys suggest there are at least 20 such structures still buried beneath the surface. 20, and possibly more. Each enclosure follows a similar pattern. A ring of T-shaped limestone pillars set into low stone walls or benches surrounds a pair of larger central pillars. The perimeter pillars are impressive, typically around 10 feet tall, but the central pillars are enormous. In Enclosure D, the two central pillars stand approximately 18 feet high and weigh an estimated 10 to 12 tons each. They were quarried from limestone bedrock several hundred meters from the site, roughly shaped, transported uphill, without wheels, without draft animals, without metal tools, and set into carefully carved sockets in the bedrock floor. Imagine the effort, imagine the coordination, Dozens of people, perhaps hundreds, working together with stone tools and a rope and raw human strength, moving a block of limestone the weight of a school bus up a hillside and standing it upright with precision, and then doing it again and again, enclosure after enclosure, pillar after pillar, over what appears to have been centuries of continuous construction and use. The pillars themselves are extraordinary objects. They are clearly anthropomorphic, human-shaped in an abstract way. The T-shape suggests a head seen from the side, and many pillars have arms carved in low relief along their narrow sides, bending at the elbow, hands with long fingers resting on or near the front surface, as if the pillar person is standing with their hands on their belly. Some have belts carved around their middles, with foxskin loincloths hanging down. They are figures, beings, presences, and they are covered in carvings. This is where Göbekli Tepe becomes truly mesmerizing. The surfaces of the pillars, and the stone benches and walls between them, are populated with a bestiary of wild animals rendered with astonishing skill and vitality. Foxes leap and twist. Snakes coil downward in sinuous curves. Wild boar charge with lowered heads, their bristles rendered in careful parallel lines. Aurochs, the wild ancestors of modern cattle, stand massive and patient. Cranes spread their wings, spiders crouch, scorpions raise their tails, and vultures appear again and again, wings spread, talons extended, sometimes in association with headless human figures. We'll return to the vultures later. They seem to mean something particular. The craftsmanship is remarkable. These were not idle scratches or rough outlines. The animals are carved in both low and high relief, some of them projecting several inches from the surface of the stone. They are dynamic, full of motion and life. A fox turning to look over its shoulder, a boar caught mid-charge, muscles bunched, head lowered, a crane lifting one leg in a posture so naturalistic you can almost hear its call. The people who carved them were keen observers of the natural world. They knew these animals with the deep, patient knowledge that comes from a lifetime of watching. They knew how a fox turns its head, how a boar hunches its shoulders before it charges, how a snake moves across warm stone in the afternoon light. They translated that knowledge into limestone with nothing more than flint chisels and infinite care. Imagine the carver. Imagine them sitting cross-legged at the base of a pillar, working by daylight or by the flicker of a tallow lamp, tapping away at the stone grain by grain, chips of limestone falling into their lap, dusting their hands white. The image of a vulture slowly emerging from the flat surface, first an outline, then depth, then the spread of feathers, the curve of the beak, the round, unblinking eye. Hours of work, days. For what? For something that mattered enough to warrant that devotion. There is one pillar in particular that has captivated researchers and dreamers alike. It is known as Pillar 43, or more evocatively, the Vulture Stone. Located in Enclosure D, this pillar bears a complex scene carved across its surface. At the top, a vulture spreads its wings, and beneath one wing it holds, or carries, a round disc. Below and around the vulture are other creatures, a scorpion, what may be additional birds, and geometric shapes. Some researchers have proposed, and this is debated, genuinely debated, not settled, that the vulture stone may represent a kind of astronomical map. The disc beneath the vulture's wing might symbolize the sun. The various animals might correspond to constellations as they appeared in the night sky over 11,000 years ago. If so, It could be the oldest known astronomical record in human history. Others are more cautious, noting that we are projecting modern categories onto a symbolic system we don't fully understand. Both positions are honest. Both deserve consideration. The truth is that we don't know for certain what the vulture stone means, and that uncertainty is itself part of its power. What we do know is that the people who built Göbekli Tepe were paying close attention to the world above them as well as the world around them. The sky mattered, the stars mattered, the cycles of the sun and the seasons mattered, and that this attention was woven into their most sacred architecture. Beyond the animal carvings, there are abstract symbols, H-shapes, circles, crescents, nets, and ladder-like forms. Some appear repeatedly across different enclosures and across different periods of construction. They may be an early symbolic language, not writing as we know it, but a shared vocabulary of signs. Evidence of a culture with complex ideas and the means to communicate them in stone. And here is something that makes the archaeologist in anyone sit up a little straighter. There is no evidence that anyone lived here. No hearths for cooking, no storage pits for grain, no middens of accumulated domestic waste, no post holes for the frames of houses, no burials in the residential sense. Göbekli Tepe, as far as we can tell, was not a settlement. People came here, possibly from great distances, to build, to carve, to gather, to do whatever it was they did within these enclosures, and then they left. They went back to wherever home was, out on the plains, following the herds, foraging the wild grasses. This was a place of gathering, a place of purpose, a place set apart from the daily round of foraging and hunting and sleeping. In a word, though we should use the word carefully since we're projecting our own concepts across an immense gulf of time, it was a sanctuary, a place where the ordinary rules of life were suspended, where people came together across tribal and family boundaries, where something larger than the individual was acknowledged and celebrated and given form in stone. There were feasts here, though. Large quantities of animal bones have been found in the fill, the remains of aurochs, gazelle, and wild ass, butchered and consumed on sight. Whatever ceremonies took place in these enclosures, they involved eating together, sharing food, the most fundamental act of community. People came from across the region, carrying their tools and their stories, and they ate together in the shadow of carved pillars under the open sky, and then they went home. And then they came back. For over a century, the story of human civilization went like this. First came agriculture. Around 10,000 years ago, people in the Fertile Crescent began to domesticate wild grains and animals. Farming created food surpluses. Food surpluses allowed some people to stop farming and specialize in other things: pottery, weaving, metalworking, building. Specialization led to permanent settlements. Settlements grew into towns. Towns grew into cities. Cities needed administration, which led to writing. They needed protection, which led to armies. They needed meaning, which led to temples and organized religion. In this story, sometimes called the Neolithic Revolution, agriculture comes first, and everything else follows. Temples and religion are consequences of farming, luxuries made possible by surplus grain and settled life. You build a temple because you can, because your crops have freed up the labor. Göbekli Tepe inverts this story entirely, quietly, without fanfare, just a hilltop full of carved stones, patiently contradicting a century of scholarly consensus. Here is a monumental temple complex, requiring enormous coordinated labor over many generations, shared symbolic systems sophisticated enough to remain consistent across centuries, and what can only be called a religious or spiritual impulse, powerful enough to motivate all of it, built by people who had not yet domesticated a single grain of wheat. Not one. They were still gathering wild einkorn and wild emmer from the hillsides. They were still hunting wild game across the plains, and yet they built this. The temple came first, the farming came after, and the timing is almost uncanny. The earliest known evidence of wheat domestication comes from sites within a 30-mile radius of Göbekli Tepe, dating to roughly 1,000 years after the site was first built. Some researchers have proposed, and this is a genuine, peer-reviewed hypothesis, not fringe speculation, that it was precisely the need to feed the large gatherings of people who came to build and use Göbekli Tepe that created the pressure to develop agriculture. The temple didn't follow the farm. The farm may have followed the temple. Let that settle. It is a quiet revolution in our understanding, but it is a revolution nonetheless. This idea that the sacred impulse preceded the practical one, that worship came before wheat, is still debated among archaeologists and anthropologists. Not everyone agrees. Some point out that we may be looking at a more complex, intertwined process, that early experiments with plant cultivation and early monument building may have developed side by side, each reinforcing the other, and that's a fair point. The truth of deep prehistory is rarely simple, but what Göbekli Tepe demonstrates beyond reasonable doubt is this: the impulse to create sacred space, to build something larger than any single human life, to gather in shared ritual and shared wonder. That impulse is not a product of civilization. It may be a cause of it, or at the very least, it is as old as civilization itself, as old as the first field of wheat, as old as the first domesticated sheep, as old as the first village. Think about what that means. Before we had crops in the ground, before we had pots to cook in, before we had permanent roofs over our heads, we had the desire to stand together in a circle of carved stones and look up at the sky and ask questions we couldn't answer. The need for meaning preceded the need for bread, or perhaps more accurately, the need for meaning was so powerful that it drove us to invent bread. This echoes something deep. It echoes the cave paintings at Lascaux and Altamira, made by people 20 and 30,000 years earlier, who crawled deep into darkness to paint animals on stone by flickering torchlight. It echoes the shell beads and ochre pigments found at even older sites in Africa, evidence of symbolic thought stretching back 100,000 years or more. The thread runs deep. The impulse to make meaning, to mark the world with symbols of what matters. This may be the most fundamental human impulse of all. More fundamental than the impulse to farm, more fundamental than the impulse to build houses, as fundamental, perhaps, as the impulse to speak, to reach across the space between one mind and another and say, "Do you see it too? Do you feel what I feel?" Now, the comparison to other sites. It helps to place Göbekli Tepe in context, to understand just how far back in time it sits. Most of the ancient monuments we think of as really old are actually thousands of years younger. Stonehenge, that great circle on the Salisbury Plain in England, dates to roughly 3000 BCE, 6,000 years after Göbekli Tepe was already ancient. Think about that. More time separates Göbekli Tepe from Stonehenge than separates Stonehenge from us. The temples of Malta, Hagar Kim, Benajra, The Gantija temples on Gozo are among the oldest freestanding stone structures in the world, dating to around 3600 BCE, and they share something of Göbekli Tepe's quality of sacred enclosure, of spaces designed for gathering and ritual rather than habitation. But even they are thousands of years younger. The Neolithic settlement of Çatalhöyük in central Turkey, one of the earliest known towns, a dense honeycomb of mud brick houses with no streets, where people entered their homes through holes in the roof, dates to around 7500 BCE. It is remarkable for its wall paintings and bull skull shrines, and it tells us much about early settled life. But by the time Çatalhöyük was thriving, Göbekli Tepe had already been deliberately buried and abandoned for 500 years. Let that sense of deep time wash over you. Let it soak into you like warmth soaking into cold hands. These are not events in the recent past. These are events in the deep past, separated from each other by gulfs of time as vast as those that separate us from ancient Rome. When you hold these dates in your mind, 9500 BCE, 7500 BCE, 3600 BCE, 3000 BCE, you begin to sense the true scale of the human story. How long we have been doing this, how long we have been building and dreaming and reaching toward the sky with shaped stone. And this brings us to one of the most haunting aspects of Göbekli Tepe, the burial. Around 8000 BCE, roughly 1500 years after the first enclosures were built, the people who used this site did something extraordinary, something that, when you first hear about it, seems almost incomprehensible. They buried it deliberately, carefully, with what appears to have been great intention. They filled in the enclosures with soil and rubble and animal bones and flint tools. They covered the pillars. They hid the carvings. They smoothed over the surface until the hilltop was just a hill again. The Potbelly Hill, round and unremarkable, its secrets packed away under tons of earth. This was not erosion. This was not abandonment followed by natural accumulation. The fill material has been analyzed, and it was brought in from elsewhere and deposited systematically. This was intentional backfilling on a massive scale. It must have taken as much effort to bury Göbekli Tepe as it took to build it. Why? This is the question that keeps archaeologists awake at night and sends the rest of us into reverie. Why would you bury your own temple? There are several possibilities, and none of them are certain. Perhaps the site was buried as an act of preservation. Perhaps the people who used it understood that it was sacred, that it contained something worth protecting, and they covered it the way you might wrap a precious object in cloth and place it in a chest. Bury it to save it, hide it from time, from weather, from the unknown people who might come after. If so, it worked. The burial is precisely why Göbekli Tepe survived for 11,000 years in such remarkable condition. The pillars that had been exposed to the elements for centuries were sealed under meters of earth, protected from rain and wind and the slow dissolving work of time. The carvings are as sharp today as they were when the fill was packed around them. In a very real sense, the people who buried this site sent it forward in time, to us. Perhaps the burial was ritual. Burial, after all, is one of the oldest human acts. We've been burying our dead for at least 100,000 years, long before we built anything in stone. Many ancient cultures practiced deliberate burial, not just of people, but of sacred objects and spaces. In Mesoamerica, the Olmec buried massive stone heads and jade offerings in carefully prepared pits. At some Neolithic sites in Britain, stone circles and timber henges were deliberately dismantled or covered. The act of burial can be an act of completion, a closing of a chapter, a returning of something to the earth from which it came. Birth, death, burial, renewal, the cycle of all things. Or perhaps, and this is more speculative but worth considering, the burial was motivated by something closer to fear, or not fear exactly, but a kind of reverent caution. Consider that 1,500 years is a very long time, 60 or 70 generations. Over that span, the world around Göbekli Tepe was changing profoundly. The hunter-gatherers who built the earliest enclosures were giving way to the first farmers. The wild landscape was being tamed, villages were forming, pottery was being invented. The old ways, the nomadic ways, the gathering ways, were fading. Perhaps the traditions that had sustained Göbekli Tepe for all those centuries changed too. Perhaps new beliefs arose, new ways of relating to the sacred, and the old temple with its carved animals and towering figures became something from an earlier age, something powerful but no longer understood, something that needed to be put away, sealed, returned to the earth with respect. We don't know, we may never know, and there is a certain beauty in that, in standing before something so vast and so old and admitting, honestly and without embarrassment, that it exceeds our understanding. The stones hold their silence, and that silence is not empty, it is full. It is the silence of things that have been known and forgotten, and may yet be known again. Now, Göbekli Tepe is extraordinary, but it is not alone. And this is perhaps the most exciting part of the story, because it is still unfolding. In recent years, archaeologists have identified a network of related sites across southeastern Turkey, collectively known as the Taş Tepeler, the Stone Hills. These sites share features with Göbekli Tepe: T-shaped pillars, animal carvings, circular enclosures, and dates reaching deep into the pre-pottery Neolithic period. The picture that is emerging is not of a single miraculous site, but of a tradition, a shared culture of monumental building that stretched across this region for thousands of years. The Turkish government has recognized the significance of this discovery and designated the Taş Tepeler as a priority research area. International teams are collaborating. New technologies, LiDAR, ground-penetrating radar, advanced dating methods are being brought to bear. It is one of the most exciting frontiers in modern archaeology. The most significant of these sister sites is Karahan Tepe, located about 35 miles southeast of Göbekli Tepe. Excavations that began in earnest around 2019 have revealed a complex that may be equally old, and in some ways even more remarkable. At Karahan Tepe, archaeologists found a subterranean chamber carved directly into the bedrock, not built up from quarried blocks, but carved down into living rock. Along the walls of this chamber stand rows of phallus-shaped pillars, and at one end a carved human head emerges from the stone floor, its face staring upward, its expression, if we can call it that, somewhere between serene and startled. Karahan Tepe suggests that the builders of this era were not merely stacking stones, they were sculptors of landscape. They carved into the earth itself, shaping the bedrock into sacred space. The skill required, with stone tools without metal, is extraordinary, and the symbolic program is clearly related to Göbekli Tepe, but not identical, suggesting regional variation within a shared tradition. Different communities, perhaps, with different emphases, different stories, but a common language of sacred architecture. Other sites in the Taş Tepeler network include Harbetsuvan Tepe, Sayburç, and Sefer Tepe, each offering fragments of this larger picture. At Sebers, a carved relief was discovered showing human figures interacting with animals, a leopard, a bull, in what appears to be a narrative scene. One figure holds a leopard by the tail, another grasps a bull by the horns. They are not passive observers of the animal world. They are engaged with it, entangled in it, caught in some drama whose meaning we can only guess at. It is one of the oldest narrative artworks ever found, depicting not just individual animals or symbols, but a story, a sequence, a relationship between humans and the wild world that is dynamic and alive. And remember, only about 5% of Göbekli Tepe itself has been excavated. Ground-penetrating radar reveals enclosure after enclosure still hidden beneath the surface, each potentially containing new pillars, new carvings, new revelations. The same is true for many of the sister sites. We are, quite literally, at the very beginning of understanding what happened on these hilltops 12,000 years ago. Some researchers have drawn connections between the Taş Tepeler sites and later traditions of monumental architecture across the ancient world. The standing stones of the British Isles, from the great circles of Orkney and Stonehenge to the smaller rings scattered across moors and hillsides, share the basic impulse of raising large stones in circular arrangements at sites of gathering. The megalithic temples of Malta, carved from the island's soft limestone, share the quality of enclosed, womb-like sacred spaces. The great stone platforms and moai of Easter Island, the dolmens of Korea, the Nuraghe towers of Sardinia, all around the world, in cultures separated by vast distances and thousands of years, human beings have felt the impulse to haul great stones and set them upright. This does not necessarily mean these traditions are connected by direct transmission, by some unbroken chain of influence linking Göbekli Tepe to Stonehenge. That would be a seductive claim, the kind of claim that makes for exciting television documentaries, but the evidence doesn't support it. 6,000 years and 3,000 miles separate them. What it may mean is something subtler and perhaps more profound, that the impulse to build in stone, to create permanent sacred spaces, to mark the landscape with monuments that outlast any single human life, this impulse is woven into the fabric of being human. It arises independently, again and again, wherever people gather and look at the sky and wonder. It is not learned from a single source. It grows from the ground of being human itself, the way language grows, the way music grows, the way the urge to tell stories around a fire grows, spontaneously, inevitably, because that is what we are. Thousands of years, hundreds of generations, people being born, living, dying, being forgotten, and through all of it, this one thread, unbroken and luminous, the need to build, to gather, to mark the earth with meaning. You are part of that thread. Tonight, lying in your bed, listening to this story, you are part of it. So what drove them? This is the question that everything else orbits, the way the perimeter pillars orbit the central pair. What compelled groups of hunter-gatherers, people whose daily lives were shaped by the immediate demands of survival, finding food, finding water, reading the weather, tracking the herds, staying warm through the cold nights of the Anatolian winter, to set aside those pressing demands and devote enormous sustained energy to quarrying and carving and raising stones? What force was powerful enough to pull nomadic groups together from across a wide region and hold them in common purpose for generations? We can approach this question from many angles, and none of them alone is sufficient. The practical angle suggests social cohesion. Building a monument together creates bonds between people. It requires cooperation, planning, shared purpose. The act of building may have been as important as the finished structure, a way of weaving disparate groups into a larger identity. We built this together. We belong to each other. The spiritual angle, and here we use the word spiritual, not in any doctrinal sense, but in the broadest possible way, meaning an awareness of depths and dimensions beyond the purely practical, suggests that these people, like people everywhere and in every time, experience the world as numinous. They lived in a landscape filled with wild animals of staggering power and beauty, lions, aurochs, eagles, serpents. They watched the stars wheel overhead in a sky unpolluted by artificial light, a sky so dense with stars that the Milky Way cast visible shadows. They witnessed the miracle of seasons, of death and renewal, of the sun's daily disappearance and return, and they responded to these experiences by making art, by gathering, by creating spaces where the boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary felt thin. Perhaps the T-shaped pillars were not representations of ordinary human beings, but of something beyond the everyday. Spirits, ancestors, archetypes, forces that the living world was felt to express. Perhaps the two central pillars in each enclosure, always taller than the rest, always facing each other across the open space, were a pair of some kind. Male and female, sky and earth, the known and the unknown. We project our own dualities onto them, and maybe that's not wrong, because duality may be one of the oldest patterns the human mind reaches for. Perhaps the animal carvings were not decorations but invocations, ways of bringing the power of the fox, the vigilance of the vulture, the patience of the snake into the sacred enclosure, summoning their presence, honoring their wildness, acknowledging that the human world and the animal world were not separate things but part of the same fabric, the same breathing, living wholeness. We don't know their names for these forces. We don't know their stories or their songs. We don't know what words were spoken in those enclosures, or whether there were words at all. Perhaps there was only drumming, only chanting, only the sound of feet on stone and breath in the cold night air. But the carvings speak, across 11,000 years, of a people who experience the world as deeply alive, deeply meaningful, deeply worthy of attention and reverence. There is a word in many spiritual traditions, hierophany, that means a manifestation of the sacred, a moment when the ordinary world becomes transparent to something larger, a sunrise, a birth, a particular arrangement of stones on a hilltop. The philosopher Mircea Eliade suggested that sacred spaces are places where hierophany has occurred, places where the membrane between worlds felt thin and where people returned again and again to stand in that thinness. Göbekli Tepe may be the oldest such place we have found, not the oldest that ever existed. Surely people were gathering at sacred spots for tens of thousands of years before anyone thought to mark them with stone, but the oldest that has survived, preserved by the very people who built it, sealed in earth and sent forward through time like a message in a bottle. And what is the message? Perhaps it is simply this: we were here. We looked up at the stars. We watched the animals. We felt something vast moving through the world, and we tried to give it a shape. We gathered in circles because circles have no beginning and no end, and we raised stones because stones endure, and we carved images of the living world because the living world astonished us, and we buried it all when the time came, because even sacred things have seasons. What does it say about us, about you, lying in your bed tonight, in your city, in your time, that 12,000 years ago, people with no technology beyond sharpened stone felt exactly the same impulse you have felt? The impulse to ask why, the impulse to wonder, the impulse to look at the night sky and feel both very small and very much a part of something. You are part of something. You are part of the longest story there is, the story of human beings trying to make sense of being alive. That story didn't begin with writing or cities or empires. It began long before any of those things. It began with someone looking at a limestone outcrop on a hilltop and imagining a pillar where there was only rock. It began with someone carving a fox into stone and stepping back, head tilted, and thinking, yes, yes, that's it. That captures something true. It began with a group of people deciding together that this hilltop was special, and that the thing they felt when they gathered here was worth preserving in stone. 12,000 years later, lying in your bed in the dark, you feel the echo of that same impulse, the impulse to seek, the impulse to wonder, the impulse to say, this means something, even if I can't quite name what. The remaining 95% of Göbekli Tepe is still in the ground, unexcavated, unexamined, whole enclosures, whole constellations of carved pillars, whole chapters of a story we have barely begun to read. And across the hills of southeastern Turkey, dozens of sites in the Taş Tepeler network await their own excavation. What they will reveal, we cannot yet imagine. The next decade, the next generation of archaeologists will peel back layers of earth and find things that will change our understanding once again. The story is not over. It is only beginning. And you, living in this particular moment in time, in this brief window, when the earth is yielding its oldest secrets, you get to be alive for it. You get to hear the story as it unfolds. That is a quiet privilege, and it is yours. And that ongoingness, that sense that the deepest things are always ahead of us, always just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered, that might be the most remarkable thing about living in this particular moment. The world is full of wonders that have not yet been found. The earth holds more than we know, and there will be mornings, beautiful, ordinary mornings, when someone somewhere lifts a stone and finds beneath it something that changes everything. Imagine the hilltop one last time, but now it is night. The excavation is empty of people. The Şanlıurfa plain stretches away under starlight. The pillars stand in their enclosures, half emerged from the earth, and above them the sky is dense with stars, the same stars, more or less, that the builders watched. Orion, the Pleiades, the long river, the Milky Way. The wind moves across the hilltop, and the stones do not move. They have been patient for 11,000 years, and they will be patient for 11,000 more. They hold their carvings, the foxes, the vultures, the snakes, the silent watching figures, and they wait, the way stones do, the way the earth does, without urgency, in perfect ancient stillness. 95% of Göbekli Tepe is still in the ground. Whole enclosures, whole constellations of carved pillars, whole chapters of a story that has barely been opened. And across the hills of southeastern Turkey, dozens of sites in the Taş Tepeler network await their own excavation. We are living in the generation that gets to find out what's under there. The next decade will reveal things we cannot currently imagine. New pillars will emerge from the earth. New carvings will see daylight for the first time in 11,000 years. And our understanding of who we are, of how far back the thread of human meaning-making stretches, will change again. It always does. But tonight, the stones stand under the stars, holding their silence the way they've held it since before Egypt, before Sumer, before writing, before the wheel. And that silence is not empty. It is full of everything those people carved and built and buried and left for us to find. The foxes carved in stone still hold their long tails. The vulture still spreads its wings over something we don't fully understand. And that's all right. Some mysteries are not problems to be solved. They are spaces to sit with, questions worth carrying. If you enjoyed this, there are more explorations like this waiting in the playlist. Journeys into the forgotten corners of human history. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm always curious what resonates, what questions linger after the story ends. Wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, thank you for listening. The Deep Archive will be back soon with another descent into deep time. Until then, the stones keep their watch, and the earth keeps its secrets. For now.